Hey, if you have your Bibles, and I hope you do, turn to Acts chapter 8. That's where we're going to be at today, Acts chapter 8. We're going to be continuing in our series called Unstoppable Church, looking through the book of Acts, really looking at how the early church started, how the movement of Jesus started, and how it expanded into the known world, how it catches up to our story here in Lavon, Texas in 2025. So we'll get to that passage in a few minutes, but that's where we'll be today. But earlier this week, maybe late last week, we were sitting around the dinner table as we always do. We've always made it a habit that most of the nights we sit around the dinner table and we have dinner together. And we do one of these things where we call it happies and crappies. So we go around the table and we share what is the happiest or highlight moment of your day and what is the crappiest or not so fun part of your day. And we share those things. And then usually what happens is after we go around the table, Tatum likes to ask me stories about my childhood like I'm a 95-year-old grandpa getting ready to pass on or something. And she just wants to know everything about my life. But so she asked me a question to tell her a story, basically just tell her a story about my childhood. And I have lots of stories. Like, I grew up in a house that we did everything outside. We weren't allowed to watch TV. We had no video games. So outside was our life. And we grew up in the middle of nowhere, so there were no rules. But in this moment, I was telling her this story about this time when I was like 11 or 12 years old, when we were over at my grandparents' house for Christmas. And we never went to my grandparents' house for Christmas. Very rarely did we go to my grandparents' house for Christmas. But we went over there for Christmas, and let me just be honest, my grandparents' house is nice, but it's pretty boring. Especially on Christmas when you're 11 or 12 years old and all the toys you just got are back at your house and they have like Reader's Digest in the NASCAR race. My grandpa is one of those people that DVR'd every NASCAR race. Before DVR, he VCR recorded the NASCAR races. So he would just watch them on endless loops of just NASCAR race after NASCAR race after NASCAR race. And when I get bored, my default setting is resorts to, I'm going to go find something with a motor and I'm going to either ride that thing, drive that thing, or see if I can make that thing go faster. So I did exactly that. I got bored at my grandparents' house. I said, it's winter, I'm going outside, I'm going to get on the four-wheeler, I'm going to ride the four-wheeler. And that's what I did. So I went outside, I'm riding the four-wheeler, and I embellish aspects of the story to Tatum because it sounds better. But I'm outside riding the four-wheeler like I had my whole life. And my grandpa it's Ohio in the winter, so there's a snowdrift. But my grandpa had also plowed the driveway because we were coming over for Christmas. And mind you, he lives on a 1,200-acre farm, so plenty of land to ride the four-wheeler. It's not like I just have one little patch of grass. But he had plowed the driveway, and he had pushed the snow into this perfect jump. And I'm like, that is the jump I'm going to hit. And so I do just that. I hit the jump. I jump through the air. It was awesome. So then I just kept doing it. Kept doing it. Well, a few days later, the snow starts to melt, and my mom's phone rings at the time, because I didn't have a phone at the time. My mom's phone rings, and it's my grandpa, and my mom picks it up, and he says, hey, is David there? I'd like to talk to him. I'm like, oh, great. What's Grandpa want? Usually it wasn't anything bad. Usually it was like, hey, mind you, my grandpa's a pig farmer. Usually it was, hey, we have pigs to castrate this weekend, so be prepared to come over on Saturday morning because we have pigs to castrate, or this or that or the other thing. But this time, I picked up the phone and he said, hey, remember when you were riding the four-wheeler the other day? I said, yeah. He said, did you run over my water spigot? And I said, I didn't run over your water spigot. He's like, yeah, mind you, this is the most improperly placed water spigot in the world. It is in the middle of his yard, where he had also, well, kind of on the edge of his yard, but a little bit in the middle of his yard, in the middle of nowhere, where he had piled all the snow that he had plowed the driveway. So every time I hit the ramp, the snowdrift, to jump it, I was just running over the water hydrant. And so I said, well, I don't think I ran over your water hydrant. He said, well, it's clearly bent, like you ran it over, and there's four-wheeler tracks that go right over top of it. I'm like, well, I guess I did run over your water hydrant then. And he said, well, just so you know, when the snow melts off, you now have a task to do. And that task involves you, and it involves a shovel, and it involves a water hydrant. And I'm like, okay. Now, so long story short, even though I've already told it as a long story short, I had to go over a few Saturdays later, when my grandpa had decided that the ground had thawed out enough to dig the hole. Mind you, when someone else is deciding if the ground is thawed out enough for you to dig, there's a little bit of a difference of opinion of this was thawed out enough or not. It was still hard. And, needless to say, my grandpa sat all day beside me, watching me dig this hole on his excavator. Never once did he start the excavator. Never once did he let me start the excavator. But I sat there all day with a shovel, digging this hole, so I could replace the water hydrant that I ran over with the four-wheeler. Now you're wondering to yourself, how does this have anything to do with Acts chapter 8? And here's why. As followers of Jesus, people who have agreed that Jesus is a great God, not just a good guy, and we have said yes to being his disciples, being his apprentices, he has given each of us a task that previously we did not have to do. Previously, we did not have to go into all of the world and make disciples for Jesus. And whether we want to do that task or not, the truth of it stands is it is a task that is set out for us to do. That we are saved and sent people. That just as God sent Jesus into the world to reconcile the world to himself, now Jesus is sending us back out into the world to reconcile the world through us. So as followers of Jesus, we have this task, and this task is to do just that, to go and make the name of Jesus known among all people. So here's the question that I kind of want to center our time around as we do get to Acts in a few minutes. But here's the question I want to center our conversation around. It's a question of this, is what could God do through me if I'm obedient to the task of reaching others? What could God do through me if I'm obedient to the task of reaching others? Now let's be really upfront with this. What my hope for this conversation, what my hope for this sermon is if you have said yes to Jesus and you have said yes to being a part of this community, that I want to talk specifically to you. And if you are still on the fence about what does this mean to follow Jesus, or you're still here investigating, hey, what is Bear Creek Community Church about? I want you to hear these things and hopefully come to a deeper understanding of who Jesus is and what Jesus is about, and really ultimately what we're about as Bear Creek Community Church moving forward. But here's the thing. We talked a little bit about this on Wednesday night. If we were to take a cross cut of Jesus' life, and we were to ask the question, what led Jesus to do everything that Jesus did? Like if we're followers of Jesus, people who are trying to emulate the life that Jesus lived, we're trying to become like Jesus and do as Jesus did, we need to be able to understand, hey, what was it that led Jesus to do everything that he did? And Jesus sums this up in Luke chapter 19 when he says this about himself. He's over at his friend Zacchaeus' house. He was a wee little man. A wee little man was he. That song comes to my head every single time. I love it. But he's over at his friend Zacchaeus' house, and Zacchaeus had some questions about who Jesus was, and Jesus comes and shares a meal with him, and basically what happens is all of Zacchaeus' house comes to a knowledge of who Jesus is. And Jesus says at the end of that passage, he says, "For the Son of Man came to seek and save the lost." That what Jesus sat in perfection in heaven, and he looked down from early on, Genesis chapter 3, what he saw was, hey, this isn't going the way it was designed to go. That this thing called sin had crept into the world, and now there's these two categories of people. There's people who are lost and there's people who are found. Right? We looked at that in Luke chapter 15. There's people who have been misplaced, and what humanity was created to be in a right relationship with God, and that is not happening. And that hasn't happened for this many thousands of years. And all throughout the Old Testament, we see over and over and over and over again Jesus being prophesied about, hey, that the Messiah would come. And what was he going to do? He was going to come and he was going to seek and he was going to save the lost. That he was going to restore, make a way to restore all of creation back to a right relationship with God as it was created to do. And as Jesus shows up on earth to seek and save the lost, in his mind, this is a life or death conversation. The Bible would put it that way, that for all have sinned and fallen short of the glory of God, and for the wages of sin are death, for we are dead in our trespasses and sins, but God, who is rich in mercy, has reconciled us through his Son, Jesus. For Jesus, this was a life and death. Hey, there's humans who were created with the eternal soul to live on forever in a right relationship with God, and that has not been the case. There's been a break. And I'm coming to restore that, because for me, it's either they're spending eternity separated from us, not like they were created, or they can come and spend eternity with us through the payment for that sin on the cross. And so this becomes Jesus' primary directive. That everything in his life, everything that he says, everything that the people that he heals was all to the intention of to seek and to save the lost, to restore people to a right relationship to God through himself. And as Jesus, he starts his earthly ministry. He's walking by the Sea of Galilee at the time, and he comes upon these fishermen. And he says this in Matthew 4, verse 19. He says, "Follow me," he told them, "and I will make you fish for people." He says, hey, come follow me, and I'm not going to just teach you more about the Bible. I'm not going to, Peter at the time, Peter's probably one of those guys who has a pretty loose tongue. I mean, we see it even throughout the 3.5 years he spent with Jesus. But I'm sure he didn't come to Peter and say, hey, come follow me, and I'm going to help you increase your moral excellence so you can live a morally upright life. He didn't say, come follow me, and I'm going to start a new religion. I'm going to draft you into this new religion. If you remember back in Acts chapter 5 a few months ago, was it a few months ago already? Probably. A few months ago when we looked at Acts chapter 5, that's what Theudas and Judas did. When Gamaliel was like, hey, there's movements that started up, they tried to create a new religion that died out. But Jesus didn't say any of that. He said, come follow me, and I will make you, I will equip you, I will teach you how to seek and save the lost, because that is the primary directive of my life. And then right before he goes back to heaven to be with the Father after he's died on the cross and rose from the grave, he says this in Matthew 28 and Acts 1. He says, go therefore and make disciples of all nations. In Acts 1, he says, hey, you will receive power when the Holy Spirit comes upon you, and you will be my witnesses. And here's what this does for us. These verses, hey, come follow me, and I will make you fishers of men, and then go and make disciples, with the primary directive of seeking and saving the lost, does this for the Christian life. This is a beautiful illustration. But it does this because following Jesus is an all of life for all of life commitment. And the primary directive of Jesus to seek and save the lost now becomes our primary directive as followers of Jesus. And it reframes everything about our life. And now we're in this tension of we're learning to fish and we're fishing. We're learning to fish and we're fishing. And there's times where, yes, it gets stretched and we're doing more learning than we are fishing. And there's times where we're doing more fishing than we are learning. I think of this even if we just use the regular fishing analogy. Not that this is not regular fishing. But if we just think about fishing, I, as a 3 or 4 year old, never was taught how to fish. I showed up with my grandma and grandpa at a campground. They handed me a Scooby-Doo pole and they said, there's a bobber out there. When the bobber goes under, you just reel it in. And as we come into a relationship with Jesus, as we say yes to Jesus, and now that primary directive becomes our command, we start fishing. And for some of us, as a day one Christian, our fishing looks like, hey, the bobber's already been, the line's already been cast. The bobber is just simply, hey, the gospel made sense to me, and here's how it changed my life. And there may be a worm on the hook that it may be the only Bible verse that we know at that point. For God so loved the world that he sent his one and only Son. That may be the only thing we know, but that's enough for us to begin fishing. And so all of our Christian life is now found in, hey, our primary directive, the thing that reframes all of our life is seek and save lost people. And we do that in this tension of constantly learning to fish and fishing, learning to fish and fishing. And now as we get to Acts chapter 8, what we're going to see is what Luke is recording, the author of the book of Acts, is simply that. He's describing for us how the apostles, how these disciples went out. They had taken what they learned from Jesus about fishing, and they went and started fishing. And along the way, they learned some more about fishing, because it's different to fish with a popper than it is to fish with a crankbait, than it is to fish with a dive bait. All the other things about fishing that I don't understand. I'm a bobber fisherman. Right? But they learn about all these different ways to fish, and they have to learn how to apply the Bible and what they've learned from Jesus about seeking and saving lost people in all these different ways, in all these different contexts, because they're constantly learning to fish and fishing, because Jesus said, hey, my primary directive is now your primary directive. Seek and save the lost. So Luke records that for us in the book of Acts, and where we're going to pick up in Acts is in verse 26. Acts 8, verse 26. I'm going to do my best to follow along on the screen without looking at it too much, because I'm going to read it straight from my Bible. But what we're going to see is this guy named Philip. And Philip is just a disciple, a follower of Jesus who's doing just that. He's learned to fish and he's going fishing. And all throughout his life, he's just continuing to do that. And it says this, starting in verse 26. An angel of the Lord spoke to Philip, "Get up and go south to the road that goes down from Jerusalem to Gaza. This is the desert road." Now I want to just give us some context real quick of just some things that are going to take place in the passage that we're going to find. Philip, this is only the second time that we read about this Philip in the Bible. The first time is in Acts chapter 6 when the apostles were like, hey, these widows, they're pretty burdensome. We need to appoint some other people to take care of them so we can stay on the path of teaching the word and prayer and those types of things. And so they appoint one of those seven that they appoint in Acts chapter 6 is Philip. So this isn't the apostle Philip. This isn't the guy who spent, it's likely that he might have spent a lot of time with Jesus, but this isn't the guy that Jesus called through his brother Andrew at the start of his ministry. This is a different Philip. And Philip, he's been pretty faithful to some degree, I would argue, because he was chosen to help serve the widows. And then it says at the beginning of Acts chapter 1 that when the persecution of the church got so high in Jerusalem, Philip seems to just abandon the task of caring for widows and moving on about his life, and he runs to Samaria. And he goes to Samaria, and it says in Acts 8:8, it says, so great was the joy in the city because Philip was doing exactly what Jesus commanded. He was seeking and saving the lost. He was learning to fish and fishing. They were seeing a great revival in the city of Samaria because Philip went there with the good news of who Jesus was. And so now he's been in Samaria for who knows how long at this point. And an angel of the Lord comes to him and says, hey, I know you're doing something really effective here, but we're gonna go over here. We're going to go to this desert road. And this desert road is this road that runs from Jerusalem to Gaza. It still exists today. You can still travel it on today. It's actually a very hostile road today. Just think about the political climate in the Middle East right now. But it's a 62-mile road, and it doesn't tell us where, but Philip goes to some point in that road, and then in verse 27, it says, so he gets up and he goes. And there was an Ethiopian man, a eunuch, and a high official of Candace, queen of the Ethiopians, who was in charge of her, and he was in charge of her entire treasury, had come to worship in Jerusalem and was sitting in his chariot on his way home, reading the prophet Isaiah aloud. So Philip goes, and at some point in time, he meets up with this chariot. Now, scholars would say, hey, we don't know if this is the only chariot that he saw that day. That could be likely because it's a pretty desert road, meaning there's not a lot of people that are traveling it. Some scholars would say, hey, maybe he saw other chariots, but the Spirit prompted him to get in one specific chariot. It prompted him to one specific chariot. And that chariot was the one that the Ethiopian man was riding in. But it's interesting because it said, hey, this Ethiopian goes to Jerusalem. And what scholars would say is, hey, he went to Jerusalem because he's in search of God. He's searching for God. He goes to the place where he thinks God should be found, and he doesn't find him there. So he maybe comes back disgruntled. Maybe he learned some things about the scroll of Isaiah, so he comes back, and he's on his way from Jerusalem to Gaza because now, once he gets to Gaza, he can get on the George Bush tollway and shoot back down to Ethiopia. But he had to get back to Gaza. But at some point in time, Philip meets him on that road, and the Spirit prompts Philip into his chariot. In verse 29, it says, the Spirit told Philip, go and join that chariot. When Philip ran up to it, he heard him reading the prophet Isaiah and said, do you understand what you're reading? Go back to the fishing illustration. The bobber has already been cast. The worm is already hanging off the hook. And all Philip is doing is saying, is the fish on? Is the bobber actually sunk? So he says to the Ethiopian, do you understand what you're reading? Because if you do, or if you're hesitant, or you're maybe not unsure, I can help clarify, and all I have to do is reel in the fish. It's already all the other work has been done for me. And the Ethiopian says to Philip, he says, how can I? He said, unless someone guides me. So he invited Philip to come up and sit with him. Now the scripture passage he was reading was this: he was led like a sheep to the slaughter, and as a lamb is silent before its shearers, so he does not open his mouth. In his humiliation, justice was denied. Who will describe his generation? For his life is taken from the earth. Now, I'm going to pause right there, and I'm going to assume, and maybe that's the wrong thing, but I'm going to assume that most of us hear that quotation from the prophet Isaiah, and we're like, what in the world does that mean? We asked the same question the eunuch did. How can I understand unless someone explains this to me, because it makes no sense? And using Isaiah's language, Isaiah was this prophet back in the Old Testament who was prophesying things to come that were 700 years before Jesus. And what Isaiah says through his prophecy is to the nation of Israel, he says, hey, there's destruction that's coming, but there's ultimately a restorer who's going to come and restore Israel back to God. And he says so out of this, he gives this illustration. He says, hey, there's a tree that's going to be cut down, and out of that stump is going to grow a shoot. And that shoot is going to be the Messiah. And then previously, just a few verses before what is quoted here, he says, hey, and that out of that shoot, the Messiah will come, and that Messiah will be pierced for our transgressions, will be punished for our iniquity, and he will be just like he reads here, led like a sheep to the slaughter. And so I almost said Peter. So Philip is explaining all of this to the Ethiopian eunuch. In fact, if we continue reading on, it says, the eunuch said to Philip, I ask you, who is the prophet saying this about, himself or someone else? And Philip's like, no, he's saying this about Jesus. He's saying about this is the promised Messiah who was to come, who came, who died on the cross, who rose from the dead, and has now been calling all people back to himself, and he's using me to help you get there. And Philip proceeded to tell him the good news about Jesus, beginning with that scripture. Like just what we did there. He probably went through the rest of the scroll, because all of the book of Isaiah would have been on there. So he just unrolls and unrolls all the way back to chapter 6, and then he says, look, this is who God is. And then he scrolls a little bit farther. Look, this is who you are. And then he scrolls a little bit farther. And this is the root that's going to come out of the stump of Jesse, who's going to be the promised Messiah. And this is what he's going to do. And bam, now we're back to where you are. Do you understand this? And they go on, and in verse 36 it says, as they were traveling down the road, they came to some water. The eunuch said, look, there's water. What would keep me from being baptized? So the obvious answer is, when Philip got done explaining it, the eunuch understood exactly who God was, exactly where he was in relationship to God, what he needed to be restored back to a right relationship with God, and he's made that confession. And then he sees water and he says, hey, I'm ready to go all in for Jesus. I'm ready to go all in for Jesus. Dunk me in the water. Simple illustration, baptism is like a wedding ring. It doesn't make you more or less married. It just means, hey, this is who I am now. I am a married person. I am a follower of Jesus. I've been dunked in the water, not for the remission of my sins, but to signify that now I am Jesus. My primary association is with Jesus, not this world. So he gets baptized. And in verse 38, he says he ordered the chariot to stop, and both Philip and the eunuch went down to the water, and he baptized him. And when they came up from the water, the Spirit of the Lord carried Philip away. This is the most mind-boggling thing in the world to me. And the eunuch did not see him any longer, but he went on his way rejoicing. Philip appeared in Azotus. I have to really slow down to say that. And he was traveling and preaching in the gospel in all the towns until he came to Caesarea. Philip shares the gospel with this eunuch. He gets baptized, disappears. This man teleported. That's the best way I can explain it. The Spirit just picks him up out of the water, says, nope, you go over here now. Like, you're going to keep fishing. I brought you here for a reason. The reason was the eunuch. Now the eunuch's on his way, and Philip's on a different journey. Preaching the same message, continuing to live, of learning to fish and fishing with the primary directive to seek and save the lost. So let's go back to our original question. What could you do? What could God do through me if I'm obedient to the task of reaching others? What could God do through me if I'm obedient to the task of reaching others? I really wrestled with this question because the question, though answerable, is not a specific answer. Though it is, you will come to an answer at some point in your life where you say, hey, this is what God did through me because I was obedient to the task of reaching others. But I cannot personally give us a solid answer of what that may be. In the passage we just read, Philip, he comes in obedience to God to reach others, and he leads an Ethiopian eunuch to faith. Now there are 300 million Christians in the continent of Africa. most of which, the predominant percentage, would trace the roots of their faith back to the Ethiopian eunuch. So what could God do through Philip if he was obedient to the task of reaching others? He changed the spiritual temperature of an entire country, entire continent. But here's the thing, maybe what we do with our little sphere of influence won't transform a whole continent. In fact, maybe I'm going to go out on a limb and say, unless you're Billy Graham, maybe not, right? But it could transform a single life. It could transform a single life. I was thinking about this morning as I was kind of running through this. What is so interesting, if you know the story of Billy Graham, is Billy Graham and his friend went to a tent revival in 1934 with this guy, with the preacher's name was Mordecai Ham. They make it to the entrance of the tent and they get turned away. They said, there's no more room in the tent. We're sorry. Like, you're going to have to come back a different day. And they turned Billy Graham and his friend away. There was one man in the crowd who said, these two teenage boys need to hear the message of Jesus, and I'll do everything it takes to get them inside this tent. And he, as Billy Graham and his friend are going back home, he chases them down and says, hey, I found room for you. Billy Graham goes into the tent, gives his life to Jesus that night, and that 3.2 million people responded to the message of Jesus because of Billy Graham's ministry. 3.2 million people. And I would sit here and say, God is sovereign over salvation. God is sovereign over the role and impact of people that they have in their life. But I really do wonder to myself, would 3.2 million people know who Jesus is today if one man didn't step up in obedience and say, that guy needs to hear this message? This is life-changing. This is a life and death conversation. But maybe our sphere of influence could change one person just like that. Maybe it could transform a family. Maybe it could transform a city or community. But what I know is that so many Christians will miss out on what God could do through them because we fail in our obedience to the primary directive of reaching others, of seeking and saving the lost. In fact, a study that came out by Barna Research just this past year, the end of 2024, in the study, it was a survey to millennial Christians, so whatever years that means. I don't know. I can't remember. But 92% of millennial Christians would say their relationship with Jesus is of utmost importance to them. That same 92% said, 62% of them said sharing Jesus with others is wrong. They blatantly said it. Sharing Jesus with others is wrong. We have seen that even in our own country. Our Vice President, J.D. Vance, said in a media press, I hope my Hindu wife comes to know Jesus as her Lord and Savior, and he got put on public blast for it. Because the spiritual climate of our world has been turning to where, hey, this has just become a thing that we don't do. It's the task we don't really want to talk about. It's a task we don't really want to partake in. But it's the task that's the ultimate directive of our lives that Jesus has commanded to us. And you've heard me say it before, and I'll say it again and again and again. I believe that the depth that each and every one of us are looking for in our relationship with Jesus is found more on mission than it is in a Bible study, that it is in a small group, or that it is in reading the next book on how to make my prayer life less lame. Because the reason my prayer life is lame is because I'm asking God to make McDonald's healthy, not, Lord, save this person's soul who I deeply love. And the question that I then pose is why? Why is that? And I think this is, if I look at Jesus' ministry, if I look at the life that Jesus lived and called me to live, it's because the saved life is not a life that it's about me. It's not about my own spiritual growth. It's not about my own transformation. Yes, those things will happen along the way, but the life that Jesus called me to live was always an others-focused life. It was always meant to be outward at its first appearance. Why? Because Jesus' primary directive was to seek and save the lost, to go learn how to fish and go fishing. And if I'm truly a disciple of Jesus, if I'm truly trying to be obedient, though I will fall short in everything that he has commanded me to do, I must reframe my entire life of seeking and saving lost, learning to fish, and going fishing. And in so doing, our faith will become more alive than it ever has. I listened to a podcast this week. It was an interview with this guy named Ken Isaacs. Ken Isaacs he has a long title. I don't remember what it is. He works for Franklin Graham, Billy Graham's son. He's worked for Samaritan's Purse for over 35 years. He's been through 24 wars, 4 genocides, and seen just countless, endless amounts of evil and natural disaster. through his role in Samaritan's Purse. I listened to that podcast, and my first response, and the first thing I said to Taylor after I listened to it and then made her listen to it was, that man knows Jesus like I would love to know Jesus. That man was in Rwanda when the Rwanda genocides and just mass killings were happening in the late 80s, early 90s. And the look on his face and the posture of his heart to say, hey, I want all of those people. I want to see more and more of those people. And what Jesus has done in and through my life because I was willing to be on the front lines made me go, that's the Jesus. Like, I feel confident to say I have a pretty good relationship with Jesus, but he knew Jesus unlike I know Jesus. And it all happens because his primary directive of his life has been reframed in that of seeking to save the lost, learning to fish, and fishing. But here's where this all comes kind of to comes to a head, is what I know about my own life and what I think I know about your lives. And that's a bold statement too. But what I think I know about all of us is if we do not have a plan to carry this out, to learn to fish and go fishing with the primary directive of seeking and saving the lost people, we'll put it on the back burner. We'll find another reason or another excuse to say, hey, it's not necessarily for me. Hey, it's, I just don't have time to work it into my schedule. And the best plan that I have heard, and I took this from another pastor in our fellowship, is what he called this who, what, when life. That, hey, as our primary directive is to seek and save the lost, that we're to learn how to fish and go fishing, we should live a who, what, when life. So what I want to do is just flesh this out through this passage together. So hopefully we can come to the end of this and say, hey, what can God do through me? I'm not quite sure yet. But I know who I'm going after. I know what it's going to take to reach them, and I know when that's going to occur in my schedule. So the first is this: who am I helping find life with Jesus? That's kind of our Bear Creek language there. Who am I helping find life with Jesus? If we're going to go back to the passage, I don't think it's really that hard, and there's probably not much debate around this, that it is very clear that the who in the passage is the Ethiopian eunuch. Philip says, the angel comes to Philip, says, go to this road. There's one person on the road. So the answer is relatively simple. Hey, Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch and Philip. That's where the Spirit was leading Philip. But the question that we need to be asking ourselves is, who did God send me to? Like, where at in my life am I recognizing that there are people who are far from God, that God has strategically placed me, whether that's in my home or whether that's in my family, and why I love spending Thanksgiving with them, they need Jesus as well. Or in my workplace, what are those areas of our life that we're going into and saying, hey, who did God put in my life for a reason? God's not in this just to muddle the waters and make us confused. He's saying, hey, I've sent you. I've sent you to the workplace that you have, to the cubicle that you have, to the house that you live in, to the gym that you go to, whatever it may be, so you can live out my primary directive, reframed your life and say, hey, who is God sending me here for? Again, this comes from a heart of something that I've said a lot in this group, is if everyone is our mission, then no one is our mission. If everyone in our life is like, well, I'm going to try to lead all these people to Jesus at one time, I will wish you good luck, but I just don't think it's going to happen. We need to solidify and come down to say, just like Philip and the eunuch, is there a person, one specific person that God is saying, hey, yes, this is who you're going for. The soil is primed. The hook is set. All you have to do is reel them in. And as a community, as we are seeking to answer that question, that's why God has given us one another, because there are times in my life where I have to ask myself the question, I don't know who it is. The places and spaces of my life seem to be transformed by Jesus. Do I need to reorient my life? Do I need to restructure where I'm going? To answer that question, we need each other to help answer that who. And when we have our who, or we're praying through who God would send us to, we start to live with this, what Peter would say in 1 Peter chapter 3, we start to live in a way that gets them to ask us questions. So we are always ready to make a good defense for the gospel with gentleness and with humility. And as we do that, our Bible study becomes different because we're learning to fish. We're learning about that person. We're learning the questions that they have, or the pushback they have against the gospel, or the pushbacks they have against the Bible. And so we're doing what the Bible says, because when the Bible talks about reading the Bible, God uses words like hunger. He says hunger and thirst. He talks about it from dehydration or starvation. He says, hey, when you're really hungry and when you're really thirsty, you're going to consume this. And when you really love someone, you start to read the Bible, and the Bible starts to read you and read that person and exemplify, hey, how does this actually work out? And the same is true with prayer. When we start having a person that we're sent for, we start praying different, because now prayer is not just, Lord, bless the McDonald's because it's rubber and I want it to taste good. But it's, Lord, there's a soul of a person who I deeply love, and I'm going to war for them in prayer, asking God to reveal Himself, asking God to soften their heart, asking God to lead me to the right response, to the right question, and all of those different things. And then we move to the second part of the plan once we have our who, and that's this, what. What does it take to reach them? My favorite part of fishing is if you fish with a bobber and a worm, you can catch bluegill the size of your hand pretty much all day long. But there's always the big fish that comes along, and he can somehow take your worm without ever moving your bobber, and it's frustrating. But as a fisherman, fishermen don't just study about fishing and then go to the lake. They do that, yes, for sure. But they don't just study, hey, what is the best lure, and then go to the lake and hope that lure works. They take a bunch of lures with them, and they don't care how they're catching them. They're just hoping that they're catching them. And so as we think about this, after we have our who, we have to think about, hey, what does it take to reach that person? Paul would use the language in 1 Corinthians 9. He would say, hey, I became a Jew to the Jews. I became as one under the law to those under the law. To the slaves, I became like a slave. Not because I am any of those things, but he comes to the end in verses 22 and 23, and he says, I've become weak to rescue and to save those who are weak. And in doing all of that, I have sought to save some. What Paul is saying there is, hey, I've sought out common ground. I've allowed their interests to become my interests. I've allowed their hobbies to be my hobbies, because I wanted to reach that person. Not that Paul is actually saving or we are actually saving, but we're trying to establish common ground so we can lay the foundation of a relationship with the hopes that God will rescue that person. And so maybe that's a dinner invitation. Maybe that's a night to play board games. Maybe for me, one of my ones is a guy that I met at the CrossFit gym, and he will do anything. He will have a conversation about anything if I say, hey, let's go to the CrossFit gym early and let's pull meters on a rower, which is not that enjoyable, but he loves to do it and he opens his heart up. And so I plan it in my schedule all the time. Hey, I'm going to pull meters with Eli. And we go and we pull meters and we sweat and we have a great time. But I've sought common ground. What can I use to build a relationship with this person through reframing my life with the primary directive to seek and save the lost, to learn how to fish and then go fishing. And the last one is this, and I think it's the most important. And I think, in my own opinion, I think this is the one that we leave out far too often. We get the who, we kind of understand what they're like, we understand what they're about, we understand their interests or their hobbies or what maybe it's going to take. And then we forget about the when. The when is this occurring on my schedule. And here's why this is so important, because a plan without a date on our calendar is a daydream, not a reality. And so we have to put these things into the regular rhythms of our life. Maybe it's already established. I already go to the office from 8 to 5 and I sit next to Angela in my cubicle, right? And that's who God has sent me there to reach. Maybe it's, hey, I don't really know what they like yet, but I can schedule dinner because they're going to eat dinner 7 days a week. And in that dinner conversation, I can ask, hey, what do you like to do for fun? Great, now I know what I like to do for fun. And all of that comes into this plan to say, hey, how are we living out the command to seek and save the lost, to reframe our lives around that command, to learn to fish and go fishing with the hopes that God may use us in ways that we never thought imaginable to seek and save the lost. And when we begin to live this who, what, when life, seeking to center our lives around that primary directive, and we love Jesus and we love people, and we go into those regular everyday places and spaces of our lives, we just go with new intentions. It's not, hey, change everything about our lives. Now, if all of the people in your life are already followers of Jesus, maybe there are some places we need to go that have some people who are far from God. But as we do that, we start to see God use us in specific ways that He's created us to reach the world through us. And we begin to find the answers to that question that we asked before. What could God do through my life if I'm obedient to the call of reaching others? And along the way, He will do more in us than He probably will through us. Our Bible study will become more rich. Our prayer life will become more deep. Those relational connections, the relational connection with Him, will become less of a theological thing and more of a real, personal, tangible relationship with Jesus. And as we partner with God, because we aren't doing this alone, that's His command in Matthew, in Matthew 28:18. He says, "I will be with you to the end of the age." And as we put a plan into action, God starts transforming us and the gospel continues to move forward. Whether that's into Ethiopia, whether that's here in Lavon, Texas in 2025, God continues to use us to seek and to save the lost people. Now, to close, I kind of want to just give us an overview of really what this who, what, when life looks like. And I'm going to use a little bit of my own story in doing so. But what this started was, hey, we looked at it a little bit, but it started with Jesus saying, "Who is my who?" And He said, "My who is the world." And what I love about John 3:16 is you can take out the world and you can put your own name there and you don't change the verse. But Jesus saw David 2,000 years ago and He said, in 1995, I don't even know what year I'm born. 1995, there's going to be this guy who's born. And I came and I sought him out. And so 2,000 years ago, Jesus said, "For God so loved David that He sent me." And what was it going to take to reach David? It was going to take the cross. And when was it going to happen? It was going to happen when, as Galatians says, when the fullness of time had come. And for 2,000 years prior, the plan had been continually getting the stage set. That just as in Genesis chapter 3, when God said, "I'm sending someone," and then for 2,000 years prophesied about that someone, when the fullness of time came, He said, "It's go time." And then the way that kind of transpired into my life is whether He thought through a who, what, when life or not. I don't think He did, but I'm going to give Him the benefit of the doubt for this illustration. But because Christ did that for me, He sent this guy named Tyler into my life. And Tyler said, "Who is my who?" And he said, "David and Taylor." And he said, "What's it going to take to reach them?" And he agreed to do premarital counseling. And it was through Tyler's obedience to seek and save lost people, to go fishing and to learn how to fish, that God would use Tyler to impact my life in ways that I am unable to explain. And that Tyler said, "Well, when's that going to happen?" And he said, "David's going to eat a lot of Mexican food, so it's going to take every Monday night for 8 weeks at a Mexican restaurant." And he put it on his calendar. And through all of that, with Tyler living out the primary command, I can sit here today and say, because of that, my life has been radically transformed by the good news of who Jesus is. And because of that, I can confidently say that I am still married. Because if before that point, I don't know what would have happened. I knew the trajectory of my life before I got married. I knew the trajectory of my life before Jesus saved me through Tyler. And so 2,000 years removed from Jesus, He sends Tyler. 10 years removed from Tyler. 10 years removed from Tyler, Jesus is sending me back into the world. And He has been using me for a while. And I sit here and say, hey, what can God do through me if I'm obedient? I have no idea. I have some big dreams, and that's not wrong. Jesus was working a plan all along. And He wasn't working that plan as an ulterior motive, but as an ultimate motive to say the world is going to be restored through a right relationship with me. So let's pray. Lord, I just thank You for, one, Jesus' obedience. Lord, I just think of, even as He prayed in the garden, Lord, just asking You to take the cup from Him. He knew what was coming upon His shoulders. The wrath of God fully poured out on Jesus, on our behalf, because we were dead in our trespasses, and He came to make us alive through a right relationship with Him. So Lord, I just thank You. I thank You for sending Your Son. I thank You for the years and years and years of prophecy in the Old Testament that points us back to your Son, that you knew this was going to take place. You knew what was going to happen, but you knew you were going to create the way. And you were going to send the way into our lives. And Lord, I just pray that even as we, as imperfect followers of Jesus, go back into the world to do what you've commanded, to seek and save the lost, to learn how to fish and go fishing, Lord, I would pray that the words that you spoke and throughout your life would be true, that we would just be faithful. And Lord, faithfulness doesn't always mean fruitfulness, and I know that I so often want to hear, well done, good and fruitful servant. But Lord, I really want to hear, well done, good and faithful servant. So Lord, help us just be obedient to your word, be obedient to your call, to reframe our life, to figure out, to sit with you, to find who you have sent us for, what it's going to take to reach that person, and when we're going to do that, so we can follow along with you in this journey, be partners with you in this journey, reflecting your heart and exemplifying your mission to the world. Lord, I love you, and I pray all this in your name. Amen.